Hi, can you hear me? Hi, Anna. How are you? Hi, Aradia. Seems like people are logging on. Hi, Pooja. While we wait, how is the weather in Bombay? Hot? Where are you all from? If you just type, some of you must be from Mumbai or elsewhere. Thanks, Aditi. I'm glad it's working well. Dombivali. How are things in Dombivali, Pooja? Nice and quiet at this time? I bet all the places that you're staying in feel very strange. I know it does here. No one's around outside. This is my first time of doing something like this, so it's really strange that I can see some replies, but I can't have a conversation. This is very unusual. Hi, Gayatri. Yeah, it's interesting. Lots of children are saying they're missing school too, which is something I thought I would never hear, but I'm hearing it a lot. Good afternoon, Sonali. Thank you, Sonali. The joys of having 3 children who like to read, I guess. Hi, welcome everyone else who's just logged in. We'll give it a little bit longer. I'm not sure how many people are going to be logging in, so we'll just wait for a little bit more before we start. While we're waiting, I'm just going to put some questions up for you to start just having a bit of a think about what we're going to cover. Hi, Raki. Thank you for the warm welcome, Teachers Help Teachers. Good afternoon, Pushlata, and also Prisha. So I think, should we make a start? Everyone seems to be logging on. Namaste, Nisha. Okay. We'll give it a minute more and then we'll start. Okay, fantastic. All right, so welcome everybody, and thank you for engaging on the comments panel on the side. I have to say this is the first time I am doing Facebook Live, so I will try my best to keep a track of the comments and try and answer your questions as we go along. And also, being my age, I have varifocal, so I'm doing a lot of this to be able to read the screen, so forgive me if my face looks strange as I'm trying to read. But welcome. What an interesting opportunity that this whole worldwide situation has given us to be together. I'm not sure if we would have had this, Jan, so I guess every cloud does have some kind of silver lining. I wanted to start by saying thank you to Teachers Help Teachers for inviting me to talk to you and to engage with you. I'm hoping that I'll learn from you as much as I can share some of my good practice that I have picked up from here as well. So our main theme for the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour is to look at mental health and well-being in children, and especially I want to try and see if we can have some discussions around how to manage expectations, cultural differences, and how children are working at the moment when online. And I suspect a lot of you are having to deal with a range of things online with children, and some challenges that you're facing, which are very different to normal teaching, but in some ways very similar, being parental pressure. So just to give you a little background to start with, my background is that I trained as a secondary teacher for economics, but then worked as an educational psychologist for a while, and then worked as a primary teacher. And now I train teachers and work in that area. So I have a mixture of backgrounds and expertise. But looking at the list today, we have lots of expertise here. So I'm hoping that you will also collaborate and share thoughts and ideas. And one of the things that I have experienced a lot of, especially in the UK, and I think it's beginning to emerge in India more so, is that children are manifesting a range of ways of expressing themselves, but also that we as adults are not always able to comprehend their well-being. One of the questions I often ask my trainee teachers is, do we know when children are not ready to learn in our lessons? Or is there an expectation that when they come to our classrooms that they are always ready? Are children ever allowed an off day in our schools? And I suspect that we are really challenged by that, because we expect children to be in our lessons, to learn, to listen, and to engage all of the time. And I know this is one of the challenges that we have here. So we're going to look at some of the factors that affect children's mental health and well-being. But more so than that, we want to look at how then we can support them. And I really want to kind of focus on this unique time where we are working at a distance, where children are at home, and how you might support parents to work with their children and actually to take this opportunity to capture and take that moment to spend time together, but to give them some structure, because parents may not necessarily have the skill set to spend such a prolonged amount of time with their children. But what an opportunity to have this moment where we are captured in homes. I guess that's one way of looking at it. But all need to stay, fathers, mothers, and in some cases grandparents, in one space. But it's such an opportunity to think about and reevaluate how we might use that. So that's what we're going to look at today. So just thinking about some of the factors that research tells us is affecting children's mental health are varied. It's becoming more apparent that they're culturally very specific in terms of the ideas and notions that children have to be able to express. So my first question is, how much expression in terms of being able to say how they feel do you feel children that you work with have? So I'm going to look for some answers, and then we can think about, and how do they express themselves? Okay, it's all very quiet. Okay. All right. So looking at, I think people are thinking about that. So that's the first question we ask, is to evaluate in the role that you have as teachers, is where does the voice of the child fit in? UNESCO and UNICEF have worked a lot, and there's lots of papers around the voice of the child in the classroom, the voice of the child in democratic decision making. And I wonder whether that is the first step, is that do we really listen to children and how they are feeling in terms of understanding? I suspect that in India, as it is in the UK, the voice of the child is not always heard. Okay, so yeah, I mean, there are various ways that children, thank you for putting that through, that our children express themselves. My question really is that when they are given the chance to express themselves, are we prepared and understand, and are we able to listen? So that's the first question we need to ask ourselves, is that, if they can express themselves and manage feelings, we need to consider the vocabulary around feelings. So if we think about the frustrated child, the child that is upset at a very young age, one of the reasons that research tells us very clearly that they are upset is around the fact that they do not have the necessary vocabulary. So one of the things that we can do as teachers is to think about how, absolutely, Pooja, that's absolutely right, facial expressions are a key, is to think about how in what we teach, whether it's through English or through languages, whether we really want to consider teaching them emotions and specific vocabulary that will help them build that language, if you like, to be able to share their understanding. So currently we are in this situation where we are in one space together, we are maybe doing a lot more talking, but actually we need to consider how we think about, yes, absolutely right, Rima, it is child-centered, but I think what we need to be is very particular in making sure that we are explicit in teaching them certain vocabularies around emotions and feelings. And I think this starts at a very young age. We sometimes miss that aspect of language to a certain extent in terms of thinking about sharing books, stories, stopping and discussing, and thinking about what the character might be feeling, and some of those discussions. So one of the things I'm going to suggest as we go through, and I think it's easier to start with young children and build our way up in the discussion about strategies, is that when you are working with children and working with parents currently, one of the things that we can ask parents to do is to think about the stories that they read and the conversations that they have, and to be explicit in the way that it makes them feel. So that role modeling, and even we as teachers, when we send things through, hi, welcome Shraddha, is thinking about this idea, and I do like what you've put in, Sanjana, about colours and if not vocabulary, I think is really important. I think we misunderstand that young children can use very explicit vocabulary as long as they understand what that means. So we underestimate the need to share words like frustration or anger or upset or happy, and actually give degrees of happiness. I feel very happy or slightly happy. And I think it is absolutely essential that we start, and for very young children, it starts in a range of ways. One is us obviously modeling, and you will know this as good teachers that you are, but also thinking about other people, stepping outside of ourselves through stories. And when we read stories, or when we read newspapers, or when we talk about the day at the beginning of the lesson or in the middle of the afternoon, is actually to put those emotive words within our discussion. And sometimes we forget to do that. And especially, I think, culturally, we are not... Absolutely, I agree. Encouraging eye contact is really important. But culturally, we are not always very good at saying, how we feel. And it is something that I think we do need to consider, how we build that in to our way of being as teachers, but also to support parents as well in how they might do. So one of the things that you might currently be engaged in, and I suspect, and it will be good to hear on the side how many of you are having to engage online, send work at this point in time to your parents and children. And I wonder that when these days are boring. This is what kids say these days. Yeah, I think, you know, is to try and give parents some guidance about how to engage with the work in terms of supporting how they are feeling. So if a child is given a piece of work and is feeling bored or frustrated, is actually to tell the parent to have that conversation and say, okay, tell me how this is making you feel. Here are some words that you can use. And I think that's quite a challenge for some parents too. Parents don't necessarily connect, and that's my first point, really. And all the comments down the side is very clearly saying exactly that, is that actually we need to begin to connect with children and not hold back and assume that because they are children that they will not be able to understand or comprehend. They will only understand and comprehend feelings and emotions if we are able to share that with them. So reading stories is a real powerful way of doing that. And as teachers, we can pick particular stories that make particular points, and especially around issues that children struggle with. One of the key texts that I've read recently, which you may be interested in reading, is a book called Happiness by Design. And it is quite profound in terms of, it's quite an analytical text, which looks at this notion that every decision that we make because it makes us happy. And I'm just going to pause there for a second and ask how everyone feels about that. That, you know, what we try to do as human beings is to come to this equilibrium that makes us happy. Is that how everyone else feels? I'm just going to pause and just see what everyone else puts out. Okay. Yeah, so my question is, do all the decisions and choices that we make as human beings, are they because we want to be happy? And is that the only reason we make choices? We need to question this and understand this to a certain extent, because actually this is pivotal in understanding why children behave in the way that they do, and why they may be feeling that their well-being is generally off balance sometimes. Where everyone is happy is a win-win. Yeah, I think essentially you're absolutely right. We do try to strike a balance between everyone being happy, but actually the interesting thing is really when you make a choice, and when children make a decision or when they behave in a particular way, I'm just going to clarify my question. Do we make it to try and get to a point where we feel happy? Whether it's a decision to give up something, to do something, is it always around the notion that it makes us happy? Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's the first thing to understand, is that when we're trying to look at children's well-being, is that they are no different. You know, what they are trying to do is come to a point where they feel at an equilibrium with themselves. So if they are feeling, you know, unattached, unconnected, if they are feeling that they are not being listened to, or that what they are being asked to do is beyond their capacity, it's too difficult, you know, that's when they start to become unhappy. And so being unhappy and how children may respond to that. Now, sometimes they respond in anger, sometimes they respond by not communicating, by you know, by having an argument with us because we are trying to have a discussion, as you say. You know, it's a good indication, it's a good traffic light to say that actually their well-being is a little bit off balance. And my suggestion is that at that point, rather than putting our assumptions and perspectives as adults, what we ought to do is ask the child, because they are, you know, they have the information for themselves. Is actually, it sounds like you are frustrated. It looks like you are disappointed. It looks like you are unhappy. What is it that you would rather be doing? Now, I am not by any means suggesting that whatever it is that they want to do, they always get to do, but it is about a conversation. And this particular skill is one that this is a great opportunity, as we find ourselves in such a confined space, to think about working with parents on. So you're absolutely right. We must have patience and skill. And I think we are all flawed in the sense that we struggle with that skill of empathy to a certain extent with a child, because we have sort of forgotten what that felt like when you did not have control and power. So thinking about that lack of control, you know, if we think about children's lives currently, there are so few things that children actually can make a decision about. So I'm just reading a long comment, sorry, like if children don't study for the reason, misjudge that, yeah, absolutely. I think they feel sad. I think what we've got to ask ourselves is that we all do well, and if we're looking at well-being and that balance, is if we have certain things in place. So we have choice, we have control, we have support, we have a structure of being able to say that absolutely freedom of expression comes with that choice. And you're absolutely right, language should not be a barrier. So my question is, in order to be able to give that sense of well-being to children, do they really have all of those things in place? So how much choice and freedom or decision-making powers do children ever actually have? So that's my next question. So if we're looking at children at this moment where they are in a situation that is out of their control, you know, they're at home with parents and are in a confined space, what we need to do as educators is think about what we are asking children to do and how much choice is there. So one of the ways to do that is not to change what you want them to do in terms of tasks, but maybe rather than sending daily tasks home, that you send them a week's worth of tasks and say, it is up to you in which order that you do things. It is a choice, you know, and you need to share your choices and see how they are doing. It is a simple shift from today you have to do this by tomorrow to this sense of independence of actually this needs to be done and therefore you have control about how you do it. So my question, I guess, is how much choice do children that you teach actually have currently? I'm just going to pause there for a second and see if I get a response. Yes, I would agree. So I guess my question was, do you think children, when they come to school or in their daily lives, do they really have a lot of choice? So is there that sense of freedom? Yeah, I would agree with you, Krishna. I think you're absolutely right that we think we give them choice, but we really don't. And I guess what we need to think about is, why do we not give children choice? And part of the reason is because otherwise we can't manage, you know, a classroom full of children. because, you know, how do we possibly manage all of that variety of options? But there are ways of allowing them to think about that, because one of the factors that I said that, you know, we need to consider is that in order to make sure that our well-being is managed, that there is freedom of choice, there's structure, there's support, that you feel valued in what you do. So it is not sustainable to give every child in every classroom a choice. However, we do need to think about that, you know, in how we conduct the school, the classroom that we have, in order to allow some of that freedom. So yeah, you're absolutely, I'm just reading the comment, not much choice at all. And I don't think that's unique to India. I think that's unique to everywhere in the world. And part of it is our fear as adults, that we don't want them to miss out. We don't want them to go down the wrong path. It's our protectivism that comes in as adults. And actually we have something quite interesting to learn from the animal kingdom, is that the risk taking and the having a go and failing is actually, as we all know as teachers, is probably cognitively much better for children than always being successful. So let's think about, you know, how within the school environment, where there are natural constraints that you cannot give every single child a choice, how we can plan for some of that. So we can, for example, consider that the work that we send isn't a straightforward, you have to do this, but that there is a choice in how they may approach the work. Okay. Oh, sorry that you're having poor network, Shraddha. I'm just sorry, I'm just looking at you. Yeah. And so we can give them choice in how they complete the task. You know, do we have to dictate that they write in a particular exercise book with a particular pen and be finished? We can give them the choice of deadlines. You know, can you finish it by this time? We can give them a choice. Absolutely, mindfulness is an absolute key word. Give them a choice to think about why they are doing what they're being asked to do. So, you know, sometimes we give children the line that you have to do this because it will be more useful to you when you grow up. I'm not sure the last time I used trigonometry when I grew up. So I think we have to be honest with our children as well, you know, and think about that openness and honesty. And that's easy to do. That, you know, sometimes we might give a task and say something like, yes, this might be really challenging for you, but I want you to have a go. Okay, I don't always expect you to succeed. You're absolutely right that empathy and mindfulness are very key, because in terms of protecting well-being, if I have a choice, then I will choose things that make me happy. And if that's the case, then my well-being will be managed. The other thing that comes with choice is the possibility of failure. Now, that is a really important thing in well-being, because where we notice children really struggle is if they have progressed through school, always succeeding, always being the first, second, or, you know, and haven't experienced failure and seen how the world around them manages their failure. That has been a real challenge. So here's my question. Early on in life, we allow children to fail quite easily, you know, because they walk, they stand up, they fall. But as we go along, where are the structured, safe opportunities for children to fail? I agree, Pooja. That's a really good way of doing it, is let's not give instructions, let them decide. Absolutely right. I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. And maybe give them more open-ended tasks that they do have a choice. drawing within lines is not necessary. No, and actually that's really an interesting point, is a lot of what we do is predetermined by the outcome that we expect to see as teachers. And really what we do by doing that is we reduce children's ability to be creative and explore their own learning, and we miss an opportunity really to see insightfully in what they are thinking. And it does absolutely have an impact on how they feel, because what they then feel is that they have to produce something to please you. And actually, in reality, they don't. What they have to do is produce something that demonstrates their understanding. And that is a big challenge, really, in reality. So, yeah, absolutely. Children are listening. I agree. Early on, we do give them, that's absolutely right. I agree with the comment that Teachers Help Teachers have put, is that we do give them an opportunity very early on when they are young. Now, the thing is, in terms of well-being and managing well-being, is we have to look at how we support failure as it becomes more and more important further up that they succeed. So here is my question. When children get something wrong within your classroom, what is our response? How are we managing that? That's a really nice question, Nihar. I can see what type of deadline should be for students for completing their task. I think that's a really interesting question. I know that sometimes I've set a task to a whole class and asked them, how long do you think this task should take? And taken the majority vote. And when they have said, it should take us a day, then we've set that as a deadline and said, okay, bring it back in a day. If majority have said, okay, it's going to take me 2 days, and you'll be surprised. I know that the common fear amongst teachers is that given that kind of choice, children will just take, I will take a month or a week. They don't. Children tend to be much more rational and much more challenging of themselves, and actually get into the habit of being really honest about what they are doing. And actually that choice really embeds in their sense of control and well-being. Reduce expectation. Yes, I would agree with that. Child-centered learning and being only facilitator. I think it is interesting that what you've put. I think it takes some development of children. You can't just go into a class in standard 8 or 9 when children haven't experienced this and launch into this way of being. I think it's a fundamental change that has to happen very early on. And also it's one that I think parents need to be coached in being supportive of, because it is that notion of failure and how we support children with failure that really needs to be managed for their well-being. Because you will know children who take failure and go, it's fine, I'm okay with this. And then there will be some children who really struggle. And it's those children who struggle with failure that we really need to think about how we scaffold them. So I guess my question goes back to, what do we do in a class when children get things wrong? We can ignore it, but we can talk to them after class. Yeah, that's one possibility. Just facilitating their individual pace of learning. I would agree with that too. And I guess one of the things I'm going to ask you, and this is really hard for teachers, is do we ever show children, and I don't mean when we write on boards and make mistakes, that we find things hard and that we have failed? Do we ever share that with children? Yeah, I would agree, Priya, that sometimes we do know that the potential is much higher than what they've performed. But I guess what I'm going to ask you is that, are we always, as human beings, able to always show our potential, or sometimes is it a journey that we go on? So sometimes we're not showing our potential because it's going to take us time to get there, even though as teachers we can see beyond them and know that they are capable. I don't know how to answer that one, Misa. I think it depends. I would, here when we train teachers, I wouldn't have marked somebody down, but I guess if the school that your colleague is working in has that approach, it makes me question, where the well-being is managed in terms of children. I think spellings are important as we want them to be. Yeah, I would agree. I'm not suggesting that none of the content is important or that it isn't necessary, but I guess I'm going to ask you this really challenging question, is that if I am not happy, I am not engaging because I am feeling frightened about being in that classroom and the subject because I get things wrong quite often, am I really learning? And the key thing about well-being is that if children are not feeling settled and calm in the classroom and not feeling able to engage with us because they worry about getting the question wrong or worry about having a go, then I suspect they're not learning anyway. So it's a good opportunity to think about, help them on learning pattern. Yeah, absolutely. Is to think about a little bit beyond the curriculum for a minute, and I'm going to ask us to step out of the pressures of the curriculum just for a second and consider what learning can take place and whether learning can take place if they're not feeling happy and settled in themselves. So if we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if I am not feeling emotionally confident to be in this space, then actually I'm not engaging with learning. And we know that happens because we see children who may have come into school because they've had an argument with mum, or they've had a fight or something, or they're upset about something. They haven't engaged with our lesson that day. They're sat, they're listening, maybe they're hearing things, but actually they're not taking that in because their well-being at that point of time is not balanced. So we need to think about how we give space for failure and the resilience that builds, because we know that the adults that are much more able to cope with the throes of life, the negatives and positives of life, are able to do so because they've built up strategies over a period of time to think about how they may connect with others to help them support through their failure. And that's a key skill that if we don't quite get that right, then we're not going to be able to support children in the long run. So my question is, apart from academic outcome, which is essential because that's one of the key reasons we send children to school, there is something else that's quite important, and this is what I'm going to just notionally call soft skills that we also do need to build in to children's ability to learn. And well-being is one of those. Absolutely right. Curiosity, emotional intelligence, we've had some conversations about that, are very important. So we need to think about how we build those in, because without them, and there's a whole movement called philosophies of learning, is that without those key skills to support their ability to learn and skills for learning, which come from thinking about their mindfulness and their well-being and their happiness, all of the strategies that we put in for them to learn their content and to pass their exams and get grades really doesn't help. Because the minute I am not feeling happy and I'm not feeling balanced in my well-being because something is off kilter, I am not listening and learning. And that becomes then counterproductive. So you can have the most amazing lessons and most amazing work for them to do. You can give them all of their choices, but actually if they are not able to balance themselves, so they haven't built resilience, they haven't built that ability to fail or to express themselves, as we've talked about so far, and be active and mindful in their own understanding of their own thoughts, then they won't be learning anyway. So it becomes then, I think, the more important skill to teach from beginning very early on. So we've talked a little bit about stories, modeling, expression that we have with very young children, and then we've moved on a little bit to talk about choice and giving children some choice and ability to express themselves. Then comes down to this notion of being able to listen. And we've talked a little bit about listening as well. But listening as adults and truly listening is really hard, because a lot of times, so when we ask a question in class, and I see this in myself sometimes, do we already have an expected answer that we are waiting for as teachers? Because we do ask a lot of questions in class. I'm just waiting to see if there's anyone responding. And I think that's one of the biggest shifts that we can make in order to support children's well-being, is that when we ask a question, is to ask it in a way that allows a child to express their notion of what that means. So, for example, if we can we decide the learning pattern from our side or let them decide? That's a really good question. I'll come to that in just one second. So if we think about the question we asked, so I teach maths quite a lot in primary, so quite often I will ask the question, what is the answer to this calculation? So let's take something really simple. What's the answer to 5 add 4? Now, of course, there is only one right answer. It is 9. However, asking it in that way, it doesn't give a child any opportunity to express anything but 9 as the answer. But I can ask the same question in a slightly different way, and then it will encompass all the other things that we've talked about. So I could ask the question, can anyone share with me how they've worked out the answer to this question? Now, that opens up a lot more choice. That opens up a lot more opportunity for children, and also gives unexpected answers. You're absolutely right, Rima. It does give unexpected answers, and actually it allows us to listen to the struggle they've had. So I'm not quite sure how I worked it out. I sort of did this. Gives me a hint about their well-being, because they were struggling. They've expressed struggle, and now I can support them, and they don't feel compelled only to give the answer that is in my head, and they are able to give quite open-ended questions. Absolutely right. And I think that is a key tool to really beginning to think. The other thing, and it seems odd saying this now because I've done all the talking and you've sort of done the talking there, is how much talking do we do in the classroom and how much do children do in the classroom? Because one of the key things that we notice in lots of classrooms is that the teacher really does talk an awful lot, and there is very little opportunity for children to talk, and therefore it really limits the opportunity for teachers to listen to children. And I'm just going to go back. I know I said I'd come back to, can we decide the learning pattern from our side or let them decide? I think if by learning pattern you mean the way in which they choose to address a question or address what they're doing, I think we ought to let them decide. How I answer a question should be down to how I want to answer a question. But we do predetermine on the whole, a formulaic way of doing it. Now, part of the reason, and I don't have an answer to this, is that the curriculum content that must be covered is very, very heavy. And the minute you ram things within the curriculum, there is very little time to deviate, and you have to get through the portion. And I hear that a lot. I hear that a lot within schools here, and I suspect that that's absolutely the case in India too. So that brings me to a certain point, really, of this balance between us as educators who are there to get results. That's what parents expect. But actually, we know in order to get those results, what we really have is this idea that actually children will need to be feeling emotionally balanced and to be able to think about this idea that how do we get them there? How do we get them to this emotional balance that we need to get them to so that they can learn? And I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to stand strong and know that early on, and when I say early on, I mean early on when we meet children for the first time, whether it's in year 8, year 9, year 10, whenever you have your first class, it's a slow pace of establishing that routine and rhythm where children are allowed to ultimately think, and express, and for you to get to know them as people. And until we make that connection with them as people, and it takes time. And there are some great strategies for doing that. There are great ways of listening, great ways of creating opportunity to listen to your children in class. It will feel like not much learning is going on. You will feel like, oh my God, I don't know, whether I'm going to cover the content. But actually, it is time really well invested, because in order to be able to connect and to actively listen, and some of the strategies to use are to allow children to do writing in the very first few weeks that talk about themselves, to paint, to colour, to draw, to choose ways in which they want you to know about themselves. Sometimes you can set that as work during the summer holidays, and allow them, to bring something to show you. I've had teachers ask children to collate items in a small shoebox of things that express who they are, and share that with the classroom. They feel slightly fuzzy, they feel like odd things to ask, but you get to know them. And the advantage of that connection is threefold. One, that the child feels like they belong in that class and are valued. And one of the fundamental things about well-being and our well-being is that notion of being valued and really being valued as people. And we all want that. We all want the acknowledgement that people are interested in me. The other thing that it does is it allows you a little bit of an insight into their personality. Okay. And that is quite unique. A child who brings things that are artistic or brings a musical something, it gives you a sense of where they are coming from. And those ideas and examples can be used all the way throughout the work that you set them. If you find that you have a very musical class, they're all very interested, then all the work that you do, whether it's maths, English, can be catered for around that theme. And actually, they will feel a sense of who they are. And I think that's absolutely right. I'm just reading planning group activities, absolutely. But also the other thing that it does when you spend some time is it allows you to connect with the expectation that the child has of the environment that they sit in. And that's really important, because for some children, the expectation is that the teacher will support, will be the one that will lead the way. And we can begin to start managing that. And for some, it is I'm here, I'll listen, but I actually can get, we begin to unpick. Because one of the things that we've got to remember is that education is about working with people and making that relationship and connection. And we know when we have a true connection with someone, then that is around that well-being. Okay, I'm just talking about how to deal with a student in grade 5 who is a troublemaker. Okay, so that's a really important question, is that when you say that they're a troublemaker, my question is, has anyone ever asked the question to the child, what is it that they feel and what is it that they're trying to express? That's the first thing. I think before you can even suggest an improvement strategy is actually asking the child, do you even want to be in school? What is it that is not, why do you behave in this way? They're about 9 or 10 if they're in grade 5. And so they're able to express some of that in their own rudimentary way. And I think that's the important thing, is that actually beginning, if I am not liked, I am going to create trouble and change perspective is required. Yeah. I think if we take the broad for a minute, let me finish my point and come back to that, is that you know, if we take that opportunity at the very beginning of our interaction with children, then we've opened the doors for them to come and express to us how they feel. And the likelihood is that throughout the year that we have them, we're able to understand that. The other strategy is to enable parents to do the same. And I think sometimes parents don't always have the opportunity or the skills to do the same. So again, you know, asking parents to spend at least once a week on a task that you set them together. And I know you're going to start telling me that parents don't have time, they are working. I understand that. I appreciate that pressure that parents have. However, I do think that it is something that you can set up at the beginning of the year as an expectation and give them plenty of time. Every Wednesday, this will come home and you have a week to consider it. And once you begin to build that habit in, we all do begin to work around that. I'm not suggesting it's every piece every week, but I think one piece a week where they have time to do it, I think it is really important. A child study is required. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I'm suggesting, is that we think about how we study. The other thing that we miss, and this is a system-wide thing, and I will come back to the challenging child in a second, is that these children have come from another teacher. And so that teacher has built up an understanding of some description, and how do we share that knowledge from one teacher to the next? And I think we do need to think about that as well in terms of that well-being. However, curiosity is needed. Yeah, I would agree. I'm not supported both to it. Yeah. You know, and I think what we need to think about is how do we share information about the growth of the child and the development of the child from one class to the next, because what we don't want to do is lose that essential information about their well-being. So I'm just mindful of the time. Okay, so in terms of the problematic and challenging child, I think it takes a little bit of work in terms of understanding what are the triggers that are making because there is an imbalance in their well-being somewhere. Something is not working for them that is making them happy. Now, it may be that they are just not interested in engaging in school, in which case we do need to consider how we engage them in school and think about that conversation. And that might take several weeks, and working with parents too in terms of understanding why that is. Now, it may be that they are just not gelling with their friends, but I don't know the answer until you know what the problem is from them. So I don't know if that answers the question. I think my first step is always to sit with the child and have that frank conversation and ask them, what is it that's making you unhappy? Is to acknowledge that they are unhappy, clearly, and to give them some questions that enable them to answer that. And only when I know what it is that's making them unhappy can I begin to think about how to get them to connect again. Because some need is not being met. Hence why they are behaving the way they are. Because generally, if there is a need being met and they feel that they are being acknowledged and appreciated and understood, they tend not to. Yeah, thank you. So in terms of curiosity, and some children don't appear to be naturally curious. That's a really interesting question. I think what that alludes to, I think, is that we need to begin to build that curiosity early on. And there is something about working in groups within a class that sets us thinking. Peer pressure is an interesting thing, and I think we don't make enough of it sometimes. So if you did have a child who was not naturally curious, I think what would be really interesting is to think about setting a task for the class and allowing them not to be curious and see if they become curious because everybody else is. So, you know, not knowing what everybody else knows is an interesting pressure that makes us. We are generally very nosy as human beings, and I think that's quite important. Sometimes, yeah, you're absolutely right. Knowing the routines back at home is really important, because we forget that what we are doing is is actually, you know, that old notion of understanding the whole child in its entirety. And at the moment, when they are all at home with parents, it's a fantastic opportunity to think about how we engage with parents and get a better understanding of those children. I'm expecting SDP school. I'm not sure what you mean, Anuj. Can you just expand on that? Reverse psychology. Yeah, to a certain extent, I think it is. I think it's about, you know, starting from a base that whatever we feel as adults and what makes us genuine, if we stopped and reflected for a minute, we all want to feel acknowledged, we all want to feel we belong, we all want to feel valued, and we all want to feel that our voice is heard and that we have some control. And when any of those things are out of kilter, then actually, you know, we feel unhappy, we feel unproductive. And that's exactly the same for children. You know, they want to feel belong, that they're acknowledged, that they're listened to, and actually that their voice is as important as anyone else's. So any of you who've grown up in a big family will know that the youngest child is probably the one that feels the most left out of the conversation. And actually we need to make a real effort to stop and think about that and say, actually, you're right. Yeah, thank you for expanding on that. And actually remembering our Indian specific pedagogy that we forget, sitting under the banyan tree and doing a well-rounded lesson and knowing that I'm doing a variety of ways of learning and not just worksheets and not just on the board and talking, is what's going to allow every child to be valued, I think. And you're absolutely right that it is about that notion of child psychology is no different. I do challenge, and you know, and there's another opportunity at some other time in the future to have this discussion, but I don't think there is a distinction between child psychology or adult psychology. I think it is about human psychology that we need to bear that in mind. And we know that being connected to other people it is one of the key indicators of being valued. So when we're thinking about how we connect, and we started to talk about this, you know, at the very beginning is thinking about our balance of choice, freedom, thinking about how we work within our families, and thinking what happens in school. It's a very artificially created environment. You know, we are not as human beings programmed really to sit in one classroom and to learn maths, and then we leave that alone, and then we learn Hindi, then we leave that alone, we learn something else. That's not how our brains work. And actually acknowledging that connectivity between things is really important, because one of the biggest challenges that children have that really make them unhappy within the school environment is this real balancing act between lots of different subjects. And if we can make that fluid and we can make the connections in the way that we plan to deliver. So, and especially in primary, I think it's much easier. You know, what I did in Hindi, I talked about this, but I actually use the same information when I discuss science. And this is where knowing the child in that first week and what interesting things they bring in, you can use examples from their lives to make and bring alive yeah, absolutely, no compartments if we can. It's tough, I get that. And bring alive their understanding of their subject and engage them. So this notion of valued, being loved, it's not to be taken lightly. I know it feels slightly alien and fuzzy to say, you know, that these sort of, you know, what I would here in England they call, you know, sort of hippie feelings. I think that they aren't. I think they're very crucial, and we mustn't ignore them. It is this notion of the idea that we want to feel a sense of control over our lives, and the child who is unhappy, the child who is thrashing out somehow, is because they're lacking control. Now, there is a balance to be struck between letting children have complete control, and I can see, you know, teachers are already shaking because, you know, classroom full of 40 odd children or 30 odd children, and having every one of them have control is not manageable. But I think there is a way of structuring it so that there is a notion of understanding. Yeah, I would agree, Priyanka. It's linking one topic to the next, because we don't think in boxes, and actually thinking about the environment that we create needs to be where that children feel nurtured, feel cared for. And it's not, when I say environment, I don't mean physical environment. We've really got to think about our emotional environment. And what the final kind of point that I want to pick up, and I think it's really pertinent to where we are at the moment. So if we think about the situation with coronavirus and think about the physical well-being strategies that we have put in place. 100 and odd years ago, we discovered that washing hands would save a lot of challenges in terms of our physical health. And I want to just put that for a second. It's a very small, very low-grade technique to keep us safe. And in those 100 years that have passed, we have built up a range of physical health strategies that keep our life expectancy higher. So, eating well, we're very clear of that. When we feel like we have a cut, we know exactly what to do and how to deal with it. So if we think about those low-grade physical strategies that we put for our physical health, my question is, do we have similar strategies for our mental health and well-being? So if you were to ask a child who fell in the playground, what do you do about your grazed knee? I guarantee that the child will have some answer that will allude to how they can take care of it. It might be wash it, it might be sit still for a while, might be put some ointment on it, might be go tell mum. They will have a very clear strategy for their physical health, because it's very low. Now, if they didn't have those strategies and we didn't work on them for 100 years, then that graze can become something quite sinister, to the point that, years and years ago, we were cutting people's legs off, right? So now I want us to think about the same thing for when it comes to mental health. I want us to consider the low-grade mental health and well-being challenges, and do we know, and do children know how to deal with it? Because if they don't know how to deal with it there, then the same analogy follows, that actually it becomes much more severe when I get older. So if I am not happy about something, if someone looked at me strangely, if I have to do work that I cannot cope with, if I have failed, these are all very simple things for mental health. But if I don't deal with it, and I don't have strategies to deal with what I do about this, then actually it can become much more severe. And we see that. We see that in adults who suffer from severe mental health, that it isn't because what they started to struggle with was very complex. It was just that they didn't have the basic mental hygiene strategies. I'm going to use that word, like physical hygiene strategies, to deal with it. So what we need to consider is equipping children with those basic mental health strategies. Life skill lessons are absolutely a way to go. But I think more than just explicit lessons, I think we just need to think about, on a daily basis, how we begin to have those conversations. So if we think about the baby that cries, we, instead of saying we'll stop crying, which is our usual reaction, is to think about, well, maybe crying is a mechanism to deal with an emotion, so let's cry it out, let's finish, and then let's move on. Because it's like saying you've cut your knee, you've grazed your knee, so let's just leave it dirty. Let's just ignore that it's there. But we can't. So, we've got to think, why do we have certain ways of being as human beings where we stop ourselves from thinking about that idea? So circle time is great. I think giving an opportunity for children and stopping and not expecting them to respond in the way that we would, Yeah, I think with special needs kids, it depends on their special needs, but there are ways like pictorial representations of expressions. Someone earlier mentioned a lovely technique with colours, using colours to show how they feel, giving them time is the essence, isn't it? To give them some time to think about how they may just go through that process and thinking about what they are doing. Yeah, encouraging children interest in activities, but I think it's about what strategies do we put in place to make sure that individuals are able to deal with what I'm going to call, and I'm probably not going to phrase it in as a neat way as I probably could, is that low grade mental trauma that they feel, and in the same way as a physical trauma, and how to deal with them. And that is something we must absolutely put in. Mental hygiene is something that we should absolutely put in to our way of being as teachers. So we are absolutely clear that washing hands, cleaning our wounds, leaving it open to oxygen has come from good, sound scientific research. Now, we know from good, sound scientific research that for mental health issues, that talking, giving time and acknowledgement, giving freedom of making a decision, allowing individuals to express negative emotions as well as positive emotions are all really, really helpful. And I think that's absolutely true. Yep, absolutely. You know, that real communicative skill and giving them vocabulary, it will give that real balance in terms of children's well-being. Now, that doesn't come only from teachers. It has to come from parents. It has to come from every individual that a child connects to. And why is that really important? Well, because it is. Because every person that a child connects to, it has an impression on their experiences and what they think is the right way to be. So we really need to consider some of those fundamental, injuries really that children can experience. Failure is one of them. You know, when we've talked a lot about how we deal with failure. A sense of belonging is another one. Not feeling like I belong is another one. A sense of trustedness is another one. So there are those things that we go through, and how do they experience? And sometimes I think we need to create those opportunities where they do fail. So setting some very challenging work is absolutely important. Trusting them to do things within school, and I know lots of schools do this, is giving them roles and responsibilities. Even something as simple as taking the register to the office is a trusted opportunity. When children get older, allowing them to walk home from school is a trusted opportunity. Now, if we don't have an opportunity to try and fail to meet some of those mental kind of skills, then we don't ever give them the opportunity to cure themselves. And that's what we need. So in order for children to be able to be resilient and feel their happiness again, they do need that balance to be able to experiment and try out. So if I never fall while walking, well, I'm not sure if I'll ever learn to walk or even run. And so sometimes we as adults need to create those opportunities so that we can talk and have those teachable moments, as I'm going to call them, to be able to pick up on. And sometimes it's done through stories. Sometimes it's done through their own life narratives. Sometimes it's done through our own examples that we share with people. And what we want them to do is have a sense of hope and optimism that it can be resolved. And so that's really quite key. So I'm going to stop there for a minute because I'm conscious of where we are for time. Are there other questions that people might have? And as you're thinking about those questions, I'll just summarize really what we've covered. So what we've covered really is thinking about embedding ways of being as adults, be it teachers or parents, in terms of how to support children's well-being. Practice what we preach. Yeah, absolutely right. And thinking about choice, thinking about that freedom of and being able to really listen. And I think listening skills are something we need to train ourselves in. Personal experience and really take that into account. I think we all as teachers feel we are good listeners, and I would say that, but I think that there is a unique skill to active listening that we ought to engage in, and we need to consider what that looks like, and think about that, and thinking about how we create that opportunity of choice and allowing children to express what we would be doing. Okay, so to summarize, I think that's where we're getting to, is that we've considered things that really put children's well-being at risk, and the factors that put them at risk, and the key ones being that of lack of choice, lack of feeling connected, lack of being listened to and acknowledged, and thinking about trust, and how we as teachers and as adults really might put some of that back into the system. So what I would recommend we do is start with just thinking about, when do we listen to children, and how much choice do they really have in expressing what they need, and do we need to support their development of vocabulary and language to be able to express, and think about how you might do that as teachers as well, so that we can ensure that children feel trusted, they feel connected, they feel like they have a place in the world, and feel acknowledged and valued for what they do. And at the moment, while we have parents at home, the tasks that we set can really encourage parents to engage with their children in that way, and use this opportunity of time to really get to know children from the very, very beginning, and to understand them as people, so that we are genuinely connecting, and start teaching those mental health first aid strategies from the very beginning. Okay, game-based, story-based learning is really important. Outdoor play, I mean, it's not possible at the moment, I understand that, but hands-on active learning, using board games are a really fascinating way of feeling, and genuinely, thinking about what we need to do, and think about all of those ideas, and some of those very old-fashioned things like singing games, skipping games, where we've forgotten some of those. Thinking about sensory play, and actually actively talking. Something as simple as watching a TV show with them, as parents, and you might want to send this home, but actually active watching, asking questions and saying, oh, that was interesting, or that looked really funny, what do you think might happen? And pausing that TV show and having that real discussion about the possibility of what might come next would be really important. Reading together with children, it doesn't have to be a book, it can be a newspaper article, and how that's making them feel would be incredibly important as well. So there are some very basic ways of building children's connectivity with us. And I would say at the moment, do send some of those ideas home to parents to try and engage with their children, because it will start making children feel like they are part of the story, and that they're not just being done onto, they're not feeling trapped at home. Because I suspect, and especially, in a city like Bombay, where children are in flats with no open spaces, it must be really challenging. So, active watching of a TV program would be an amazing, simple start that you can send to parents to do, and that both parent and child can start with something that they love to do. Would be really lovely. Or even listening to music and how music might make you feel. So just something that doesn't have a big resource requirement, because it doesn't need it. You're welcome. I'm glad it's been useful. Okay. Thank you. Because this is new to me, I'm not sure what to do next. I just want to say thank you for all the comments. I hope I've kept up with everybody's comments. It's just been really fascinating. One of the things that we are doing here where I work is collecting some stories of how teachers are working in innovative ways with children in this particular situation. So if any of you want to share, I have an Instagram page on which I would love to put some of your stories up. So if you've got a picture with a short caption, you want to send it. I think if Teachers Help Teachers can share that Instagram page, that would be amazing. But it's called Educators Unify. I'll put it here. So it would be great if you want to send me some stories, we can definitely share what you're up to, because it's always good to share wonderful work that educators do around the world. Let me just write it there. There is the Instagram page. You're very welcome. And I hope that you enjoy the time if you can at home. And I hope you all stay safe. And keep doing what you do amazingly, which is be great teachers. Because when all the children come back to school, they're going to need you all to bring them back into a nice, smooth rhythm. Take care. Bye, everybody. I'll just wait to see if anyone's got any other questions. Thank you. Look after yourselves. Be safe.